Thank you very much, Mairead. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to thank the NBC MSO for inviting the department to present to you this morning on the very important topic of existing buildings and our existing built environment. I was speaking, for the most part, over the next 30 or so, or 25 or 30 minutes, on the extensions and alterations to our existing built environments, the application of our building control legislation, principally the building regulations and the building control regulations in our existing built environment. Because I was saying, we do have an awful lot of very useful existing buildings, sometimes underused, the existing built environment capable of being brought back into use in a reasonable and pragmatic manner. Mairead has already mentioned the 2018 publication, Bringing Back Homes, which was updated in 2024. Obviously, I'll be mentioning it in brief closer to the end of this morning's presentation. But that document is a very, very useful document to, I suppose, navigate all of the regulatory requirements, all of the provisions that apply in respect of our existing built environment when buildings are brought back into use, be they planning permission requirements, building regulations, fire safety, minimum standards and rental accommodation regulations, waste management licenses for reuse. It does highlight the simplicity of approach in the restoration and reuse of our existing built environments through simplistic case studies. Everything I was speaking to this morning does relate to existing buildings. When we speak to building regulations, it's very easy for the mind to jump straight to the very new buildings and constructions, modern methods of construction. It's very simple and straightforward. It's very easy to dive straight into the technical guidance documents and start to read them and say, how do I make this apply? But I prefer to, for this morning, take a step back and start with the basics of the building regulations themselves, of going through those regulations in a little bit of detail as to how, where and when the functional requirements of the second schedule to the building regulations apply, what it means in terms of a material alteration or a material change of use or the provision of replacement services, fixtures or fittings in the built environment. They do apply to existing buildings. Again, when we think about an existing building, the mind could be drawn to a very old structure, a building in a special area of conservation or a protected a building with a protected status. Building regulations, as Mairead has quite succinctly and correctly said, they apply to works to which the building regulations relate. This is a simplistic overview and infographic of the building control system in Ireland. At the very top, we have the Building Control Acts 1990 to amended in 2014 and slight modifications for various reasons in 2020 and 2022. Under that principal legislation, we have regulation making powers, where the minister can make what's termed as building regulations. They provide for the minimum standards of provision of essential characteristics for health and safety in buildings. We have the articles of application to those building regulations, and we have the simple, straightforward approach to conformity with the building regulations set out through the technical guidance documents. And that's going to be the vast majority of the focus, I suppose, for my focus this morning. Down the middle, we have the control system, the building control regulations, the systems of administration that provide a mechanism for notification, for, in some cases, certification, the lodgement of and grant of applications for specific works. And in support of that, we have the likes of the Code of Practice for Inspecting and Certifying Buildings and Works and the Building Control Management System maintained by the NBC MSO. I will be speaking a little bit to the building control regulations and the control regs that apply in respect of existing buildings. And off here to the final, I suppose, tier or tranche of it, the Building Control Act establishes building control authorities the powers of inspection and enforcement. I won't be speaking to that, but I know the presentation too will be speaking to inspection and enforcement by local authorities via Pat Nestor. So well covered there. Jumping straight in, building regulations. What I'd like to term as the articles of application, and sometimes missed, sometimes forgotten. These set out exactly where, when, and how the parts of the second schedule are to apply. And they're done in quite a deliberate and constructed manner to set out definitions, they set out methods of measurement of height and floor area in buildings, critically set out what are exempted buildings or works from the compliance with the building regulations. What is the requirement, the minimum requirement for the design and construction of all works in buildings under Article 9? Article 10 is not missing. I'm just not speaking to it today because it relates to new buildings. Article 11, extensions and alterations. Article 12, the provision of services, fittings and equipment. And Article 13, changes in use. They apply to all manner of existing buildings in the existing built environment, from the non-residential building that's converted to use as a residential building, whether it be one or many residents within it, concentrating on dwelling houses this morning. The dwelling house in the middle of our towns that has ancillary use over it, so a shop that is ancillary to the main use of the building being a dwelling. This is the terminology of ancillary use is clarified in bringing back homes, and just the dwelling house itself. There are exemptions, there's 14 of them, 13 if, the Class 10 exemption was removed in 2000. But for the remainder, there are 13 exemptions from the general requirements of the building regulations in total. For works to existing dwellings, there's one really that is of note, the Class 3 exemption, a single story extension to an existing dwelling, which is ancillary, so it has to be forming part of the main dwelling, it has to be there for the express and purpose use of the dwelling, and it consists of, and is very, very limited, conservatory, a porch, a carport, or a covered area. So some sort of structure or apparatus that's typically outside the thermal envelope of the building. It does have limitations in size, floor area in general of less than 23 square meters. If it happens to be a porch, maximum 2 square meters of floor area, and a height of less than 3 meters. If it falls into those categories, step away from the building regulations. They're under the articles of application, Article 8, the exemption, and the third schedule doesn't apply. But this is the single class of exemption, which means everything else in terms of works will fall under the building regulations in some way, shape, or form. Which brings us very nicely onto the broad general requirement, and this is where you can take the statement as Mairead said, building regulations apply to building construction works, and this is where it comes from. Article 9, all works to which the building regulations relate have to be designed and constructed in accordance with the requirements of the second schedule. What are the requirements of the second schedule? We know them as parts. Part A, structure. Part B, fire safety. Part C, materials and workmanship, all the way down through to Part M, access and use. So all works have to be carried out in those parts where they are made to apply under the articles of application of the building regulations. It can sometimes come up that we have parts where, for example, Part M likes to get people into buildings, Part B likes to get people out of buildings. These don't, there can be innovative solutions, especially in existing buildings where we want greater provision of doors for fire safety, whereas access and use would prefer fewer doors and with as limited opening force as possible, perhaps even open doors in any given scenario. The question does come up, does one part take precedence over another? Well, Article 9.2 settles it, no. All parts must be carried out, number one, to comply with this part of the second schedule, and number two, to avoid breaching any other requirement of the second schedule. So no one part takes precedence over another. They all must be made to comply all the time, where they're applicable within the building regs. And this, in existing buildings particularly, can take a little bit of innovation in design and construction. The third aspect to the design and construction of works, there shall be no new or greater contravention of the building regulations when works are being carried out. In essence, this is often quoted, sometimes misconstrued. You can't make an existing situation worse in a building, but if there's something that is already there and it doesn't have to, if it doesn't meet the requirements, but you're not altering it, it may not necessarily need to be brought to the requirements of the building regulations. A simple example would be an existing window in an existing dwelling house. The windows that are designed and put into a house that was built 50, 60 years ago. If we consider all of the requirements of windows in terms of the building regulations, we've got Part B for the opening aperture, Part K for the prevention of falling out of windows and restrictors, the height of the window off the floor. We've Part L for energy efficiency of those windows. If you're breaking out a new opening, those 3 requirements would apply because it's a new opening. You couldn't break out a new opening that contravenes any of the parts of the requirements of the building regulations. Makes sense. If it's an existing window, it might not be 800 mil off the floor. It might not have the area provided, but if you're not altering the window, you're not making it worse. So no new or greater contravention, don't make it worse. You couldn't lower, if you had an existing window at 800, you couldn't lower it in contravention of Part K of the second schedule. When we talk about this, and I've mentioned works about a dozen or so times already, we always talk about works. What are they? There's a definition there. Any act or operation in connection with the construction, extension, alteration, repair, or renewal of a building. So it's a very, very broad definition. When we talk about a dwelling, we're talking about a house or flat forming separate unit of accommodation. When we speak to repair or renewal, and this terminology does show up both in the building regulations and in the building control regulations, particularly in the case of repair or renewal works for fires, where consideration for a fire safety certificate may be given. Works of a maintenance or restoration nature, keeping the building in good condition or return of the fabric to its original condition. So maintain the building as it's intended to be, but not carrying out new works, not making new alterations to the building, but just maintaining and keeping what is there. It's fair to say in a lot of our existing dwelling houses, if brought back into use, if they were a dwelling, if they are still a dwelling, maybe just works of routine nature of repair and renewal to the building. And that is all captured under bringing back homes. Moving on to Article 11 of the building regulations, the articles of application, extensions and alterations. So when works are being carried out to existing dwellings, they can will typically undergo some sort of alteration within the fabric of the building. Sometimes might be associated with some form of extension to the existing structure. Both types of works are captured under Article 11, but they are subtly and distinctly different in their manner of application. First and foremost, Article 11 applies to all works in connection with the building, and importantly, even if you're extending a building, Article 11 also applies to the existing structure fabric, but only to the point of prohibiting any new or greater contravention of the existing structure. So again, don't make the existing building worse by the introduction of a new part of a new extension. Obviously, if you're altering and extending the building, the relevant parts apply. If it is an extension, all relevant parts of the second schedule, the technical guidance documents, apply to the extension as would be expected of any what we can term as new works built on new foundations. So parts A, structure, B, C, D, E, if there's a separating element from one dwelling to another. F, ventilation. G, H, if there's new sanitary conveniences installed. J, if there's a new heat producing appliance installed. K, if there's a new stairs installed. Well, obviously, if there's any windows, K would apply as well. And L applies to such extension works. Down here in the bottom corner, a little icon, technical guidance document M with a red X through it, not because I don't like TGDM, it's a very important document, but in the case of an extension to a dwelling, there's a very important line under Article M, M5. Part M does not apply to an extension to a dwelling or material alteration, provided that, very important, you're not creating a new dwelling. So if you're extending a dwelling for the purpose of just extending the dwelling, fine, Part M doesn't apply. If you're extending the dwelling for creating a new dwelling, it does. Material alteration, same article, same section of the building regulations, but even through the imagery, subtly different. But material alteration applies to buildings in a slightly different manner. They're defined distinctly that an alteration for the purposes of the building regulations is any works that by themselves, if carried out, would have an impact on parts A, structure, B, fire safety, or M of the second schedule of the building regulations. When we talk about structure, if you're knocking out a new opening, obviously it's going to have, if it's in a structural or load-bearing wall, it's going to have a requirement, whether it be internal or external. Part B for dwellings, it's quite ubiquitous because Part B applies as much to the linings of buildings as it does to the provision of means of escape, the provisions of elements of structure to resist fire, provisions of access and facilities to the fire services. In an existing dwelling, for B, for example, if an existing dwelling has stone or plaster or similar face walls, it would more than likely comply with the surface spread of flame requirements of Part B. Deciding to add combustible timbers to the walls or the ceilings, if they didn't meet the requirements, would cause a new or greater contravention. So the B does apply in an awful lot of cases. It's just care and consideration in their general application. Repair and renewal does apply to the structural integrity of the building. That's under Part A. Under Part L, if you're replacing windows, external windows and doors, Part L applies, and it also applies Part L under major renovations. So where more than 25% of the external fabric of the building is modified, that's the thermal envelope, so floors, the four walls, floors and roof, it can trigger a major renovation, and in that case, the whole building has to be brought up to a cost optimal level under the provisions of Part L of the second schedule. Again, Part M generally applies to material alterations, but material alterations, bear in mind, the building regulations are written with all buildings taken together. Part M does not apply again to works to material alterations to existing buildings that are dwellings, provided don't create a new dwelling. So Part M in this case, just for the simplistic alteration, wouldn't apply, but you can't make it worse. I also have Part D off to the side here. Part D, you don't see it in the article of application, but in every technical guidance document, and even in the parts of Part D itself, Part B applies to all materials, all works that go into a building. So if you're bringing in new materials into a building, they still have to comply with the provisions of Part D, that they have to be proper materials. You have to use the right material for the right purpose in the right manner, and has to be installed in the correct manner, so installed in a workmanlike manner. So if we take an existing building and someone just moves into it in the morning and there's nothing done to the building, well, we're not bringing in new materials, we're not carrying out an alteration. If we start bringing in plasterboard, for example, to repair the ceiling of a two-story dwelling house, well, that's immediately a Part B requirement. That plasterboard is supporting the fire resistance of the ceiling. Plasterboard also has to be, it's a harmonized product. It has to comply with Part D for proper materials and workmanship. In order to be put into place in a building, in order to achieve that fire resistance, has to be installed in a workmanlike manner. So the correct fixings, the correct spacings, correct taping, etc., all under Part D. So this applies generally speaking, and it's, again, a very, very important part of it, because Part D brings together all the other parts of the technical guidance documents. They all specify our performance, energy efficiency, access and use, fire structure. But this is the one that says, use the right materials, use them in the right way, in the right manner, put them together in a workmanlike manner. Moving on to Article 12, services, fittings and equipment. And again, when we look at our building regulations and our building control regulations, we can think of, well, if it's notifiable, it carries an importance. But again, stepping back to the building regulations and the minimum standards for health and safety of people in and about buildings, they have a relevance and an importance of their own right. Whether they're notifiable or not, they have a relevance and an importance. Part G, hygiene. To provide hot and cold running water in a building, to provide surfaces of sanitary ware that is easily cleaned and that actually is fit for purpose, that doesn't literally waste water when we're flushing a toilet, that has a provision of storage of water in the case of a water cut-off. If we're building a new building, we do have those minimum requirements for hot and cold running water, of minimum sanitary ware, of a water closet, of a wash basin in its vicinity, for kitchen hot and cold running water, for a drainage board, and for the kitchen sink. That's the minimum provision under Part G. If replacing it, if renewing a building, putting in new sanitary ware, putting in the new water closet, Part G applies. It has to conform to Part G in terms of the the products going into that they're easily cleaned, that the cistern has to have a maximum flush capacity, as it has to have a dual flush requirement, just to be able to move water in a predetermined, calculated manner. Same applies Part H if we're placing apparatus in respect of Part H, be it an on-site wastewater treatment or drainage to public utility. Part H will still also apply to such works. And again, when we are using this apparatus, Part D, it's always there, it's always sitting in the background. Are they proper materials? Are they sourced? Are they harmonized products? Are they covered by an ETA? Are they covered by an Agrimo certificate? Part J, equally, heat-producing appliances. Don't see them very often in new builds, but in existing buildings, we still have the likes of stove installation, still have different heat elements installed. Where they are provided, again, Part J applies. So it's not enough to put in a new solid burning or solid fuel apparatus into a building. You also have to consider the provision of inlet air supply for the combustion appliance, the discharge of product combustion. So if you're burning something, it's creating carbon monoxide, it's creating soot, has to come out of the building somehow, has to be carried out in a proper manner. Have to provide warning, if there is a new installation, warning and release of carbon monoxide. So the provision of detectors applies in terms of these new apparatus. Protection of the building, if you're creating heat, it has the capacity to set a building on fire if not installed correctly, so has to be installed in a proper manner, proper materials. Same for provision of information. So the homeowner, at the end of the day, who has to use this, has to put the right fuel into the apparatus, has to clean a flue if necessary. They're entitled to receive information on how to carry out that, how to maintain a system for its duration, for its lifetime, in a manner intended. And we have Part J for fuel and storage systems. If we have new storage systems installed, Part J. So these provisions will apply to the parts of the building and will also apply in terms of no near or greater contravention. So you can't just put in a stove and saw it an awful lot actually in 2009, 2010. New stoves went in the crash years. They were improperly installed. We had a lot of structural fires caused by them just by being installed too close to stovework. Change of use. This one of the more complicated of the parts of the second schedule. So change of use is a defined term within the building regulations. I do appreciate that we have other legislation that can define a change of use. Planning, for example, will have its own change of use, but when we're speaking to the building regulations, they're fairly well defined within the provisions itself. Speaking to dwellings, there's no specific change of use defined under the building regulations, but there's actually a different position. It's set out in the Building Control Act itself, that where any building which was not originally constructed or used as a dwelling becomes built as a dwelling or through its works or becomes appropriated for use as a dwelling, that is a defined change of use. Article 13 applies. What applies when we come into it? Well, an awful lot of our building regulations again. A1, A2, Part B, B6 through to B11 of the second schedule for fire safety, Part C4, Part E of the separating elements. F, ventilation, so you've converted a dwelling to use as human habitation, indoor air quality becomes important. Part G, Part H, Part J, if you're installing your heat producing appliances in it, and Part L, conservation of fuel of energy, all applies in respect of existing buildings. So it's not as comprehensive as a new extension, new building, but it's nearly there. And it's proportionate and pragmatic in terms of the existing built environment. Do appreciate. For an existing building, you are dealing with existing foundations, existing external walls, existing fabric of the building, and these provisions apply. Okay, so far I've been speaking to what you have to do, what is applicable and required in respect of the building regulations in any existing building, and if it's speaking to parts. And from a legal sense, we kind of come away from this point of, well, I know that I have to comply with fire safety. I know I have to comply with access and use, or sorry, not access and use, but heat producing appliances or structural requirements in respect to my particular building. The how-to, fairly, again, in a fairly straightforward manner set out. The grey box to the one side is the functional requirement in respect of in this case, Part G. We have a set of legal statements. There should be adequate provision for drainage and wastewaters, or for sanitary conveniences installed in buildings. In fire parlance, adequate means of escape provided in the building for the persons, and adequate detection and warning, and structured adequate provision of structural elements in it. All the legal text is in the grey box, but the how to comply, the prima facie guidance, the detail, the performance measures to be met are all set out in the series of technical guidance documents. So the articles of application lead to the functional requirements in the second schedule, the text in the grey box. They give a measure or a mechanism to comply through the technical guidance documents. But we're talking about existing buildings, existing fabric. We're not building up from the foundations. We're not starting from scratch. Sometimes it's difficult to put a square peg into a round hole. So in this case for existing buildings, there's a very important set of statements included in the introduction to each and every technical guidance document, and the provisions are omnipresent in each TGD. First and foremost, the application, in the case of material alterations or changes of use, so we're looking just to the material alterations, just the material change of use. We're not looking to extensions, we're not looking to new builds, we're not looking to new services generally of existing buildings. The adaptation without modification of a TGD may not in all circumstances be appropriate. So yes, the TGDs are prima facie, yes they are simple, yes they are straightforward. If there's a difficulty encountered with an existing building for a sound reason, we can refer to this introductory provision. The adherence to guidance, including codes or specifications intended for application to new buildings on new foundations, may be unduly restrictive or impractical. So it may be, but it has to be proven. It can't just be a case of, I don't want to, it's too expensive. It just may be unduly restrictive or impractical to comply with. So buildings of architectural and historic interest are especially like to give these circumstances. So you can't break one law to achieve another. If it's a protected structure, you can't rip out protected elements on this, in the case of building regulations or in the name of it. There are ways and means to achieve it in keeping with the current fabric, and those, in many cases, these are set out in the TGDs. While the TGDs do give good, simple, straightforward guidance, in the case of existing buildings, alternative approaches based on the principles contained in TGD may be more relevant and should be considered. In that case, we've actually published last year an entire guidance note on alternative approaches to compliance with building regulations. But it's not all that. Just because the introductory provisions say that the TGDs may not be all approaches, may not be entirely practicable, there is also very, very good guidance contained in each and every technical, not in each and every technical guidance document, but most TGDs of how to meet the requirements for existing buildings. In Part A, the appraisal of existing buildings and recovery of existing roof structures. So a mechanism for assessment in accordance with Part A. Under TGDB 2017, meeting Part B, the provisions for means of escape, for consideration of linings, treatment of linings, for material alterations and material change of use, for consideration of external fire spread. So we may not always have to modify the external openings, even if they're too close to an adjoining building in terms of fire safety requirements. If it's already there, if it's not causing any regret or contravention, it might be appropriate to leave it in place. Under TGDE for sound, there's references and provisions to protected structures and adherence to the sound requirements for existing buildings. Under TGDG, there's good guidance on the replacement of a pan and cistern versus just replacement of the cistern. So in TGDG, if you're replacing both the pan and cistern, it's because the entire apparatus is coming out, it is appropriate to replace with the dual flush facility, the 4 and 6 litre flush requirements. But if you're only replacing the cistern and not the pan, that might lead to a greater compliance problem in terms of Part G. So you don't have to you have to measure the cistern to the pan that's in place. There's provisions of Part H for personal alterations of drains and sewers, Part J for replacement and reuse of existing flues or chimneys, and under TGL for energy efficiency, there's a whole section on existing buildings. Section 2 addresses existing buildings for compliance with Part L in a prima facie manner, again particular to to material changes of use and material alterations. I said I'd speak briefly to the building control system, the other part of it, the building control regulations, the requirements for notification through the building control management system. There are some types of works, and this is a reflection of the guidance that's contained in bringing back homes in a simple tabular format. Conversion of a non-dwelling into a single dwelling as a material change use or planning permission is required, a CM without additional documentation. Material alterations, inclusion of an ancillary shop as part of the existing dwelling. Notice is not required because neither planning permission nor fire service is required. Certain extensions less than 40 square meters commence notice without additional documentation. Extension to a dwelling of greater than 40 square meters commence notice with additional documentation, or the commencement the notice with declaration of an intention to opt out of statutory certification. And for loft conversion, the requirements in respect of notification, as in you're not doing much to the outside of the building. But this again, this is the requirement to notify is a good process, an important statutory process to follow to notify the local authority of critical works being carried out in their functional area, to allow them to assess those works for risk, perhaps for even for inspection. But the building regulations, irrespective of the requirement to notify or not, the building regulations will always comply. They're always there in the background, and they shouldn't be conflated or construed that just because one doesn't require notification doesn't carry the importance of conformity with building regulations. Again, loft conversions can be one of these. If we're moving from a 2 to a 3-story building, there are implications for fire safety, for means of escape pathways, for openings of windows in such constructions. There's implications for structure. If we have new loads going into attic joists, and we're creating a new floor. There's implications for energy efficiency, for if there's a new stairs being provided. There is provisions in Part K for a new stair to a loft conversion. It may not be notifiable. It doesn't mean that the necessity to comply with the requirements of the building regulations to ensure the health and safety of people in and about buildings should be forgotten or diminished. Finally, we've spoken to the building regulations, the articles of application, to the functional requirements, to the technical guidance documents. But even outside of all of those guidance documents and all of those processes and procedures, there's other good guidance that does exist in the existing built environment. Maria's already referenced, and I've mentioned myself, Bringing Back Homes, as I said, published in 2018, updated in 2024, freely available on the department website, is a very, very good guide for the reuse of existing buildings. It goes through 4 types of building typology: the single dwelling brought back into reuse, building with an independent shop or an ancillary shop, a non-dwelling converted into a dwelling or into multiple dwellings. It goes through all the reuse options and simple, straightforward approaches to conform to the building regulations. Published about 4 years ago, an updated loft conversion guidelines to highlight and bring together all of the provisions and matters that relate to the conversion, all the precautions to be taken in respect of fire safety, of structure, of ventilation, of energy efficiency in terms of loft conversions. More recently, the Improving Energy Efficiency in Traditional Buildings Guide was published, and the NSAI has published SR 54, Standard Recommendation for the Energy Retrofit of Existing Buildings. It is an awful lot of reading. It's there to support the provisions, the application of the building regulations in the existing built environment. But importantly, and in closing, I just want to leave you this, first and foremost, I always like to start with the application of the building regulations. What applies where and when? Start with the building regs, start with the conformity, start with the simple, straightforward rules that are contained in the building regulations, in the technical guidance documents. Secondly, and after that comes the notification before the work started. It's incredibly important to notify in advance of works commencing. There can be complications where there's improper or no notification given. There is an awful lot of good, useful guidance documents. I haven't mentioned all of them. Mairead had a slew of other documents in her own presentation that are applicable, and I know there's presentations later on existing buildings and improving energy efficiency from Jackie Donnelly. There's an awful lot of good knowledge and information out there. The building regulations are not an impediment to reuse. They're designed to work with the existing built environment, and there is flexibility and proportionality in their application and use in the existing built environment for the reuse of and revitalisation of our towns, cities and villages. Okay, thank you very much for your time and attention.